Welcome. It's just turned 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 7th of July, and you are watching episode 14 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight for issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Decentralisation of Government and Can It Deliver Government, Smaller Government and a Leaner and More Efficient Bureaucracy, is my guest Peter Senior. Peter is Assistant Manager and Management Consultant of more than 30 years and has operated his own business for that time. In 1984, after the 9-year Robert Muldoon National Party government had bankrupted New Zealand, the new Labor government under David Lange embarked on one of the most radical government restructuring programs ever undertaken by a Western country. Peter led many of the projects restructuring corporations and government departments, such as New Zealand Electricity Department, Telecom, Forest Services, Transit New Zealand and the ports. Come election time, political parties often professed their support for smaller government and decentralisation of administration, but it has never materialised. What can we learn from the New Zealand experience? And will there ever be an appetite for such a momentous change in Australia? Welcome, Peter. Can we start with you giving us a little bit more detail of your background?
Okay, Bill. Well, I started life as an engineer, an engineering degree at London, and then studied management at Cambridge University. Then I got into computers. This was the days where we had things like bit masks that probably only Andrew will know about now, for 3 years. And at the end of that, I decided the UK was really not the place to spend the rest of my life in, because it was going downhill so fast, 3-day working weeks, it was dreadful. This was just prior to Margaret Thatcher's genius. So I went to New Zealand and I joined a newspaper company as a sort of industrial engineer, and a few years after that I ended up as general manager for a few years. And then suddenly along came Brierley Investments and bought up the company and did some magic, and it took them literally 2 years to turn the most successful publishing company in New Zealand into a mess. The bits were sold off and they lost a fortune. One of the earlier things they did was boot me out, which was splendid because I was refusing to go along with their stupid directives, which was a good move for me in a sense, because I went along to what was then W.D. Scott, that later turned into Deloitte Consulting, and said, because I'd had them involved in trying to restructure the Auckland Star newspaper. And at the end of it, they said, well, we really think you ought to be a managing consultant. Would you like to meet our managing director? And the rest is sort of history. And it was, let me see, 3 years after that, 2-3 years after that, that the David Lange and his compatriots took over. Quite extraordinary as a Labour government. There was the three of them, Richard Prebble, Roger Douglas and David Lange. Now, over the period of about a couple of years, they literally transformed New Zealand. One of the first things they did was to bring in what was called the Financial Responsibilities Act, which treated New Zealand's finances as more or less the same as a corporation, and demonstrated that New Zealand was actually bankrupt according to doing it properly, as it were. So why they took it upon themselves to change everything, I think it just was that they realized that very little being done by the New Zealand government in the past had been effective. And so almost by definition, it had to change. And change it they did. But they did it in a very consultative way. They brought in a few very, very capable management people, particularly management consultants, and worked with us as far as how to change the main things they were doing. Now, one of the earlier ones I was involved in was the New Zealand Electricity Department that owned and ran nearly all the generation, transmission, supply in New Zealand. And one of the first things we did is look at the strategies. Now, the strategy had been to supply power to anyone who wanted it, the quantity they wanted it. So as you would know, there were always massive peaks and troughs. And their primary focus was building more power stations, spending a fortune on it. And the whole ethos of the electricity department was engineers. Engineers love building things more than anything else. We assessed the electricity needs for the future, and we identified there was no need for another new power station for 12 years. 12 years. So, amongst other things, our restructuring had to focus on operational efficiency and marketing, and where in particular marketing was bringing in time of day tariffs. So there was an incentive to move away from the peaks. So this was done under a new board, which was set up, and these were mostly business people. There was an exceptionally capable chair, and we were brought in as a team. There was 3 consultants and 3 executives from NZED. And I think you'll find, just as an aside, a lot of what I'm saying, I think, has a lot of relevance to what could, and I would dare say should, happen with a new North Queensland state. So we produced a completely new structure, and this was introduced, and the majority of the staff thought it was great and went along with it. Unfortunately, a lot of engineers were not needed, and a lot of the more senior engineers, the construction engineers, were set up in a separate company to sell their services mainly to overseas clients, and they did very, very well indeed. I came in for a second restructuring. The chief executive, Dr. Dean, now Sir, could see that we'd gone as far as they could in the couple of years. We'd modified most of the functions, accounting, HR, maintenance, and so on. But they needed a more decentralized structure, which is what we then introduced. And that worked extremely well. In a sense, the sad part is that gradually bureaucracy and politics started coming back in vogue. And it took quite a while, but it's similar to, I think, most government departments in New Zealand now. They've really returned to their old bureaucratic ways. Shall I stop
just
there?
A matter of interest, just a matter of interest. So what was the sort of time scale from starting a change to getting some reasonable, recognisable efficiencies, and then the time scale to see it dissipate through the normal process of, bureaucracy and politics? Okay, well, I'll start with the project itself. We came up with the report in 7 months. This was approved by the board, and then implementation was, in fact, two of our team were the key people implementing it, and the new chief executive, Sir Roderick Dean, came in quite a way through the implementation. But I'd say the answer to your question, the efficiencies and the gains started within 1 year. There was a long way to go. I'd say maybe 50% of the improvements and efficiencies were achieved within 1 year. With a lot of heartache by some people, and
most people were really excited and enjoyed it. And this leads on to, I'm sort of jumping around rather. One thing we found is in most government departments, the great majority of people were basically bureaucrats at heart. They sort of saw their job as coming into work, carrying out a process, and carrying out the process properly and efficiently all day, and then going home. Now, one of the fundamental changes we brought in, and we did this with all the state-owned corporations, is say, nope, your job is to achieve objectives. We have a plan. You're going to work with us on the plan. We will define not just your role, but what you are required to achieve. And it may sound almost a bit silly, but we often found it took a while for the typical bureaucrat to get the idea of this, but once they appreciated that they were achieving outputs, outcomes, results, and they were being measured on these, and there would be performance bonuses based on these, a lot of them actually blossomed. Flip side of that, though, is we found that something like 20% of the staff just couldn't or didn't make the jump. They were completely happy to just come along and apply the process all day. And the idea of sort of achieving results was sort of foreign to them. And they need to go, basically, and particularly where there's a minority of them who really were deliberate saboteurs. And they have to be identified in early stage and removed.
Nicely.
Let's go is the official word.
just as a matter of interest, in going back to 80s and that, what was the makeup of New Zealand's energy mix? I mean, geothermal wouldn't have really been a big thing at that time yet, or was it underdeveloped?
Oh, yes, it was.
Cold,
New Zealand's thermal power was one of the earliest in the world, from the geothermal near Rotorua. I think it was the first or second to be put in the world, and it's still going strong. The majority of power was from hydro, and New Zealand's very lucky in as much as it has a large amount of hydro, but one major disadvantage is all short-term stuff. There's no huge lakes, or there is one, but that's a separate issue. And so they have to have a lot of thermal to back it up. So the biggest power station in New Zealand is at Huntly, and that at that stage was coal, and we changed it over to gas. So because there was large gas wells off Taranaki, and but it maintained the ability to be either coal or gas. But when the hydro started running short, water was running short, drought, whatever, then they were able to take over the total production with the thermal.
That's fairly interesting, because I think a lot of people would have thought that New Zealand hydro would have been there all the time. But like you say, if you haven't got the storage capacity behind the dams, well, that's got to be a limitation. But in this new generation, I'm sure a lot of people will come out there, well, put in wind farms, and we'll have pumped hydro. We'll let it go down, and we'll put it back up with the turbines power.
Well, unfortunately, New Zealand was one of the earlier pioneers in wind generation. The one positive is there's a lot of places, as well known, where it's windy as hell in New Zealand, and the wind just doesn't stop, really. So that's a major advantage. But there were, unfortunately, major subsidies, and certainly the arithmetic shows that without the subsidies, very few, if any, of the wind farms would have been built at all. They're pretty well the same as the rest of the world.
So with the restructure, was there a more introduction of statutory authorities or that, or they were already part of the problem? How was the decentralisation? Was it basically administrative, or was it also centralisation of power or more authority to lower levels of operation?
Well, we set up the corporation, Electra Corp, as it was called then. They were all something Corp then, just to get the message across. 3 parts. One was the generation, then there was the transmission, then there was the marketing. And the marketing was the high tension transmission, and they supplied the local electrical supply authorities. They didn't have to, but they were actually going along with a lot of the changes, and a lot of them were transforming themselves very well. The Transpower was the national grid, and the guy who was set in to run it, Bob, he was a brilliant genius. He really was a genius with a heart of gold, and everyone loved him, despite the fact that he was mad as a hatter in many respects. And so one thing we did, which was again quite interesting, thinking about the future for a state of Queensland, we had for all these projects, we used to search the world and find the best people on knowledge on the subject. We brought in a group of top consultants from Sweden. Swede Power has always been known as one of the most efficient electricity producers in the world. We brought in this group, and they were totally bemused as to what we were doing. Just didn't make sense to them. It was so different. And I remember we had to get an arrangement between the generation and Transpower, the national grid. And this normally couldn't be done. It was meant to be done on a sort of not just a contractual basis, but a sort of competitive basis. We could see this wasn't going to work. So we set up an office where we had both sides in the same office. So they were continually talking to each other and working out the best solution. It worked brilliantly. And the Swede Power people said, it's completely impossible. It's never been done before in the world. You mustn't do it. And a year later, they came by and said, well, look, it's working absolutely brilliantly. Congratulations. Now, the message from that is there'll be a hell of a lot of people when, I say when rather than if, North Queensland State is being set up. There'll be loads of people who say, you can't do that. You mustn't do that. It's different. No one else has done it. Don't do it. Don't listen to the buggers. If it's sound principles, sound management, go ahead and do it, and find people thinking out of the box who will actually go along with the form of management that you want to apply for the state.
In regards to the electricity situation, was there most people sitting in their house, there's only one thing they're interested in, well, a couple of things really. They wanted to make sure when they flick a switch, the power's there. That's primary, but also that the cost is reasonable. Was there any consumer gains made in regards to the reorganisation, or that was an afterthought? It was just basically get the organisation and the management structure, and the price mechanism or the results of that would generate whatever it did far as pricing.
The fundamental requirement was efficiency, sustainability, and stability, and that was fundamental to everything that was done. And one of the several very positive results is that power prices were kept extremely low. And thinking about Australia now, I weep at what I see is actually happening. It's totally disgraceful and appalling. And I'm tempted to go into really bad language on the subject.
But you won't.
No, far too polite.
Well, I mean, the price of electricity is risen nearly about 10 times the rate of the normal costs of living, and basically it's all come about from government policy, not the price of fuel, not the price of labour, not the price. It's basically all come about from policy, and we've gone from one of the cheapest household prices of electricity to one of the right up there with those European countries as far as pricing and that. We're really at the top of the market.
Well, if you listed the 10 worst things that could be done, the Australian government, central and states, have done every single one of them. I'm really pushed to think of a single thing they've got right. I say that based on, I've got a huge amount of experience on this. And even when I was came over here, I did quite a big project for Collide. That was being run pretty well. And interestingly, the general manager there was a guy I worked with in New Zealand, who was who's the general manager of the Huntly Power Station. Super guy.
I think you and Freeman McMahon could team up in regards to their opinions of the performance of government over years and the problems that they seem to add to people's lives.
Well, it was a great sadness to me when I saw things starting to return to being driven by politics rather than being driven by what was set up as the right sort of corporate objectives, cost price, sustainability, and so on. And in fact, Electricity Corporation was broken into 3, and that worked quite well. But quite a lot of the people who'd been in the early stages, who'd been very knowledgeable about the best sort of management to apply, they tended to be being replaced by people who were more politically inclined, who were sort of maneuvered by political requirements. And I haven't been involved for, 15 odd years now, so I can't really speak with too much. I know 10 years. I can't speak with that much authority. But the last project I did, which was an assessment of the contracting out for the wind power for the main electricity group in Meridian, was called, in the South Island. The guy I worked with very closely was excellent, but he was sort of overridden by a guy who was a total political animal. So yes, it was sad to see things starting to fall apart.
Moving on to well, we've experienced things, especially with our telecom. It's gone from completely government owned to basically a private enterprise now, although the government holds a lot of the shares in the Future Fund. So what was the activity in regards to modernising telecom in New Zealand, or changing the structure there?
Okay, well,
was it again a breakup of retail, delivery and facilities?
No, it wasn't. In 1985, 6, the post office owned both all the postal work and the telecommunications and the largest post bank. Now, the first thing we did was break it into 3 separate corporations. So we'll stick with telecom initially. The person who was chief executive of Electricity Corporation then was captured and moved over to take over as chief executive of Telecom. And he dragged his head of HR, who was a super guy who died a few years ago, my best friend, and me over to sort of head up a project to restructure Telecom. And in a sense, it was more difficult than Electricity Corporation, because the sort of the admin bureaucratic culture was so built in. And they also suffered from a major problem was, although like Electricity Corporation, they were a monopoly, and they had all the bad traits of a typical monopoly. They wouldn't accept anyone else would really have an opinion. They were making an absolute fortune from overseas calls. You wouldn't believe the markup for overseas calls in those days was several thousand%. And literally the majority of the profit came from that and subsidized the rest. But anyway, we divided it into a separate, several series of operations of marketing. Geez, I've forgotten the details now. Several breakdowns for the operations, and it worked pretty well, but it was more difficult to implement because Roderick Dean was unable to get enough really excellent people around him. He had a small cadre of really good, capable people who fully agreed with his approach. And Roderick was an absolute genius, well deserved his knighthood when he got it. And I loved working for him. But it was more difficult, Bill. And this was the time when ADSL was coming in, and a lot of new technologies were coming in. And the technologies were tending to rather drive a lot of the way telecom operated then.
So how long was it before the appetite of the government for change started to diminish and the support for it? Because David Long, I think he only just did the one term and a little bit, and then he handed over power. He didn't stay as long as most people thought he could have stayed. So
No.
did it start dissipating during his term, or
Sure
was
did.
it something?
Sure did, Bill. He and the triumvirate, Roger Douglas and Richard Preble, had done such brilliant things. Roger Douglas was just on the point of bringing in a flat tax rate for the whole of New Zealand, amongst many other things. And after about 3 years, David Long was rather busy, and he spent Christmas in Wellington. He lived in Papatoetoe in Auckland with his wife and 3 or 4 children. Anyway, for that 2 weeks, he shacked up with a lady called Margaret Pope, who was a die-hard socialist. And over that fortnight, she persuaded David Longy to sort of return to his normal socialist ways, which were completely opposite what he'd been doing for 3 years. So he came back after the holiday, and the famous quote was, "We need to have a quiet cup of tea." And Roger Douglas and Richard Preble were absolutely furious, and things started going downhill from there. But a lot of the restructuring was already going gangbusters and couldn't really be stopped. And so it was quite a few years after that, after Labour was booted out and National got in, and things went downhill quite gradually after that.
In that period too, Australia's always been sort of heavily unionised in a lot of industries, and that, especially the electricity industry and manufacturing. Was New Zealand in the same sort of vein? Was there issues with the unions in telecom and electricity?
There were, but they mostly were not a major problem. one of the things that the Longy government couldn't do was modify the industrial relations law. And when they went to the national government came in, this was around about the time of the famous or infamous Margaret Thatcher, who was bringing in all the good industrial relations stuff like contracting out. And New Zealand was able to bring in quite a few changes to the industrial relations that allowed much easier and better contracting out, reduced the exorbitant power of the unions, and came up with what was generally a pretty good balance. And I think certainly a much better balance than Australia ever achieved. And it still is pretty good.
I think another thing is, at the same time you had David Longy, we have obviously had a Labor government under Hawke and Keating.
Yeah.
Now, I was sort of, in my younger days, came from a household that was Labor supporters, and it takes you a while to sort of grow your own views in regards to taking in the whole picture sort of thing. But I looked at the Keating-Hawke government as the best Liberal government or Conservative government we never had. I mean, for that period, the people in the unions behaved themselves immensely. I could not imagine a Liberal government ever being able to sell the Commonwealth Bank, but there was not a whimper like from anyone when Hawke and Keating floated the dollar, which is sort of a no-no for the left, and then turn around and sold the Commonwealth Bank. They were the first ones to really head us onto this privatisation of government assets. But everyone just, bit their lip and got on with it, and successfully sold the Commonwealth Bank. And also, we started seeing things like actually a Labor government taking on some of the militant unions that were being excessive. Because I lived in Victoria in that time, and we had the BLF, and they were absolutely, at the drop of a hat, they'd go on strike or pull some other farce, But they actually, the Keynes state government, I think, was in that time as well, and the Hawke Keating federal government, and they basically rolled the BLF out of existence. So they're the sort of things that can happen sometimes when even under a Labor government, and probably could never happen under a coalition type government. Do you think Longy, maybe not only because he was had a new thought or idea, but the fact that he was Labor was able to get these things where there would have been more opposition to it if it had been tried by, say, a coalition, Liberal government or a national government?
I think there's several messages from that. One is that it's quite extraordinary, but in many democracies, it's Labor governments that manage to bring the most effective changes in. Now, why is that? I think it's because they start off with more support from the, dare I say, working class, and that is absolutely critical. And those who've achieved brilliant changes, David Longy, Hawke, were natural spokesmen, natural leaders. They spoke the sort of ordinary person's language. They were very human. Remember the time Bob Hawke cried? They were really human. And David Longy was absolutely brilliant leader. And I don't know if you ever saw when he was addressing the Oxford Union debate. This went down in history. He was arguing the side for nuclear. And at one point, and this is the bit in history, he leant forward against the opposition and he said, I can practically smell the uranium on your breath. So that's what I'm saying. I think capability, being extremely astute, but they've got to be natural leaders. They've got to communicate with the common people. I think that's more important than actually communicating with the elite, and particularly the right-wing elite.
Oh, well, you can always bring them along for a few bucks anyway. As long as there's a buck in it for them,
Yes.
they'll probably come along anyway. You don't have to do much convincing there. It's just a matter of monetary or making a profit. But one of the things I did notice in that era, in the 80s to the 90s and that, there was basically, again, living in Victoria, we had the federal Labor government, we had a state Labor government. But one of the big things I noticed is the way the Labor governments sort of interacted with business, and sort of, there was huge movements to entice businesses and that to come into the state or whatever. They were forever breaking ground somewhere in regards to, this is going to be a new technology park, or they've done some sort of encouragement or agreement with some major international company to do something or whatever. And it was going on all the time, but usually they didn't actually come to fruition, but they are all very keen to be seen as developing the economy and that at that start, because I remember the technology park was going to rival, the Silicon Valley type thing. I think it was actually tied around the medical sphere outside Laverton at Point Cook, and they broke ground out there. And I think it's just a housing estate now, so they're the things that sort of can go wrong with some of the visions.
Yeah, there's so many factors that I think influence politicians, and I think influence all of them, and a lot of them are fundamental things from overseas as to what places like the UN and, dare we say, like the deep state, big pharmaceutical companies, all have their own objectives and covert strategies, and these things will invariably have a massive influence on what happens in relatively small economies. And I put Australia there, and New Zealand's obviously minuscule in relation. And I think if we can just, in terms of a North Queensland state, I did mention this in something we swapped emails on. I think a major problem and a major role for the head office, centre, whatever you call it, will be somehow stopping these obsequious moves that come from overseas. Now, probably one of the most obvious ones is the United Nations Agenda 2130, and they've got their hooks into a large number of councils who have been pushing quote unquote sustainability. And when you look at what they actually mean by sustainability, it's bugger all to do with sustainability. In many senses, it's quite the opposite. It's more to do with control in a socialist manner. I think there's an awful lot of influences that come from overseas that I think it seems to me that both state and federal governments in Australia at the moment are grossly over-influenced by these very nefarious views and activities from overseas.
I think another thing is, we're just touching on councils and that, getting involved in things that we probably, I come from a generation where councils were roads, rates and rubbish. Councillors were elected, you almost knew the person, and they were usually just general people around the suburbs that the general population knew. They could have been doctors, businessmen, just ordinary workers, whatever, and they just got elected to council. It was just a honorarium that they got, a few bob. The mayor might have got a car and a few extra dollars sort of thing, but it wasn't much to it. But now we've got a situation with councils. Some of them, some of the bigger ones like Sydney Council, that are actually sort of dealing in things like foreign affairs, like when you have a government policy, a council policy where you're sort of divesting interest in Israeli buying goods and that. I think it was called BDS was the catch. And when you've got councils sort of involved in that, it's sort of a little bit out of the scope. So we have I'll just go through our system. I'll just share a couple of pages here. This is Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, the difference in sizes everyone can see easily, but we have 535 local councils in Australia. On top of that, states, just picking one state, Queensland, we've got 93 state electorates, and then of course you've got the Commonwealth, and we've got 150 lower house seats. So you can get the picture in regards to the amount of authorities and interests as far as bureaucrats there are in Australia and operating in Australia. Now, with the councils, one of the things that we've noticed in recent years, or probably going back a while as well, they seem to get caught up if there's a foreign manufacturer or a business or that coming into Australia. They seem to bend over backwards to try to entice them to come into their regional area, and they start offering incentives. All these things are confidential, so and I think that's one of the worst things that there are in Australia. There's all these confidential agreements that the governments get into. Like, we can't even know how much the state government paid to get the NRL Origin game into Townsville. I mean, it's a secret, that we'll never know. And if that's how petty they are keeping those sort of things a secret, it's rather scary in regards to the other agreements that put us into hot for. We just don't know the amount of money. And so I think in Townsville at the moment, you've got the local council tied up with hydrogen, Energex hydrogen project that's got to be worked out with Kawasaki Engineering of Japan. But we're not across what agreements they've gone into to entice that. And it's the same thing for other defence contracts or any other contracts. They try to get to their region to help boost employment, and then also, but at the same time, we don't know the extent that they're tying up ratepayers' money or reducing rate collection from these people that would have contributed to the council's coffers. So that's one of the things we're always caught up with. So when it comes to, we'll just stick to a state, Queensland in general. Just forget about a North Queensland state or that. Just dealing with what we've got: the state government, and then we've got all these local governments. And then we've got a lot of government authorities. We've got Sunwater that basically looks after water infrastructure in Queensland. And of course, we've got Ergon dealing with most of the electricity assets, especially all functions of electricity in North Queensland. Whereas in the southern area, in southeast Queensland, they do have a retail competition sector where Ergon isn't the only person in the market. There's a lot of resellers or distribution people. So you can get a bit of a deal going for best price depending on your use. So what things would we target? What things would we target for decentralisation, do you think would be the first sort of area that we'd look at? And also, is it administration functions that are sort of pushed out, or is it also the authority and funding needs to go with it so they can operate effectively?
Just quickly back to a previous point you were making about the secrecy. I think one absolutely essential fundamental principle will be everything is transparent, unless there's one hell of a good reason not to be, and that would probably have to be carefully assessed. For instance, tell me an electricity project, for instance, a wind power generation project, where there's been a full cost-benefit analysis that's been transparent and released. This seems to be the way all governments in Australia and in many other parts of the world, they seem to think they only need to release what they want to release, which is what they think is in their interest. So I think transparency is absolutely critical.
But every election people go to, the party's saying, "Well, we promise transparency and accountability in our government." It never happens.
True, never happens, and yet they get re-elected. This is the quite extraordinary thing. Just on the contracting out, subcontract. Oh no, we'll just do the ownership thing first. I think I'm not aware of many assets which the Queensland government owns, which it needs to own or should own. It seems to me a few things like parks, I would say that should be owned by the state, but I see no reason whatsoever why the state should own any electricity assets. None whatsoever. But, and this is the big but, it's every one of these points you can say, this is the way it should be done. But it's always part of several things. I think we were talking last night, we mentioned Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. One of the wonderful points that Douglas Adams made was the interconnectedness of everything. And it was actually very sound, because I think you should never, ever pick out one part of an organization and optimize it just for that part, because it will always interact with other parts. It's part of a total package. And all these parts need to be optimized. Optimizing one part on its own won't work. We found this, I found this more latterly in reviewing quite a lot of organizations that had problems. Now, what typical management consultants tend to do is they talk to other people, investigate a lot of things, and they come up with quite a few serious issues. And then they work out a plan to fix those issues. We never, ever did this. In my view, that is fundamentally totally wrong. Once you understand the organization, and we can talk Queensland State or potentially a North Queensland State, once you understand the issues, that is the time to step back. You need a framework, set of rules, set of approaches, and then you should go in to design the structure based on the right framework. What I always found is the organizations, whether it's a government department or corporation, that suddenly found something major thing was wrong and tackled it, it then got out of kilter with other things, or other things started going wrong because they're all interconnected. Should I stop at that point?
In regards to functions, I mean, with decentralization, is there an administrative method or or a means to just decentralise administration. And what I'm saying there is just not have it all located in one city where all the bureaucrats from all the different departments, are basically sitting in Brisbane. Is there any benefit, do you think, in regards to sending them out, dispersing them across the whole state, so they don't gather in that? So although they've got different roles, they're different departments. The fact that they now have now away from each other, they can sort of work, and you can find out who's being efficient in their processes, and you can gain benefits in regards to seeing which department is starting to get some efficiencies that you could bring over to other departments.
Okay. Look, just before I answer that, Bill, can you just give me 10 seconds out? I think my wife's trying to ask me something.
No worries.
And we do have our priorities, don't we?
We do. Just while Peter's gone, I'd just like to talk about some of the things in regards to decentralisation, whether we can just have a decentralisation of function of departments, and that delivers a benefit to the states. In regards to, at the moment, we've got all departments sitting in Brisbane and the greater part of the bureaucracy, and that's all generating income for southeast Queensland by dispersing those departments to Rockhampton, Mackay, and Townsville, and even Cairns or any other seated centres. We now sort of will have this. They'll still be doing their job and hopefully efficiency, but they'll be in different communities spending their money, and basically that provides a benefit to all the regions by that dispersal of those departments. While I was away, Peter, I was just pointing out that if we just took departments and moved them all over the place, they still can carry out their job, especially in the days of our modern technology. You don't have to actually engage with anyone. You don't have to go to their office or anything like that. So, say if we move the Department of Tourism and its function from Brisbane to Cairns, you've now got all those public servants working and operating in an area that's highly dependent on tourism, and have a better understanding. But all those public servants are now putting money into the local economy, not Southeast's economy. And then say if you move Department of Energy and Mines to Mount Isa, way out there, well, then they'd add to that economy, but they could still do their job. And it's same with a lot of other departments. You can use agriculture and fisheries, move it to Mackay or something like that. So that's not so much as a decentralisation as much as it is disbursement of administration, but it does have an economic benefit to the greater to the regions and sort of bounces up the economies. If we just keep on with decentralisation in the regards of authority, is things like the government creating, for want of a better word, quongos like Sun Water, where it appears to be a corporation or that, but really it just belongs to the government anyway, but it's just operating under a corporate banner. And we saw this in Victoria back in the 90s, I think it was, 80s and 90s. We used to have just Melbourne Water for the whole state, and it broke it up into all these quongos, Yarra Water, Northeast Water, and all those sort of things, and it became fairly dysfunctional in regards to an overall plan for water requirements for Victoria. Is creating things like Suncorp, where it's still owned by the government, can that be counted as decentralisation, or is it just a furphy?
I think it's a huge furphy. Most of these points, I think it's much better to refer to as a higher level principles framework. I think what tends to happen, there are so many individual things, it's much, much easier to look at one small issue, specific thing, and try to optimize it and forget, as I was saying before, it's actually part of a totality, all connected. Now, at the highest level, on the subject of decentralization, the way I see it is there's two approaches you can take, fundamentally different. One, you can centralize most things, or you can decentralize most things. Now, centralization is normally done because whoever's making the decision wants to have direct control. Decentralization is in many respects a lot more difficult, and in almost every respect, if, this is the big if, it's done properly, you will optimize performance. There's several critical things that have to be done to get either of them right. One is, we touched on this before with the sort of Bob Hawke, David Longy, there has to be excellent leadership that have the support of the key people, and those who don't support him or her should be booted out. Boot Brisbane. Excellent leadership. There's got to be excellent management too, and it doesn't matter whether things are centralized or decentralized, there's still got to be excellent management. And there's nothing magic about this. Good management really is all in management 101. There's nothing particularly difficult or magical about it. As far as grouping people together, whether for whatever the function is, I recall a delightful project we did when we were restructuring the New Zealand Tax Department, the IRD, and Revenue Department. In those days, the Treasury were the brains. They made sure that they had all the best brains there, and they basically ran New Zealand, and they had very clear ideas what should be done to reorganize the Inland Revenue Department. I was the consultant on the project, and I didn't get on at all well with the Treasury guy. He detested me. You know, we used to have a meeting every month, and there was about 30 people there, heads of various departments and parts of the government, and it was all chaired by the most brilliant guy called Sir Ivor Richardson, who was the top High Court judge. Anyway, one of these meetings, a project was put forward by the Treasury guy and said, we've decided to centralize all these departments because of economies of scale. Economies of scale. So I explained it, and I piped up and I said, Sir Ivor, I was not aware of this going on, and in my experience, you will not get economies of scale from this. And there was stony silence. And Ivor told the Treasury guy, well, please come back next month and give us your full workings and demonstrate why there is economies of scale. Well, they had whole groups of them working away, huge amounts of effort. And the next meeting, between gritted teeth, he said, we've established there would not be economies of scale. But I find this is sort of a bit of the centralization versus decentralization. I think the advantages and effectiveness and performance are invariably achieved better if it's done at a local level, as long as the HR, the people side, is right. If it's part of a plan, if it's part of a coordinated plan, and the leaders at the local level are part of it, they know what they're doing, they're incented to perform certain targets, and they get a good team around them, they'll outperform any centralized setup any time.
But it also depends on the people currently at the centre of control letting go, or being prepared to let go, and depends on how much oversight they want, and the mechanisms they put in to ensure that oversight's there, whether it's intrusive or it's just observing until such time, it identifies problems and needs tweaking of that.
Well, it needn't be at all difficult, but you're absolutely right. It is a major issue. It's very, very difficult for a lot of people who've been involved in government for years and years, or in some organisations, to, as you put it, let go. But the simple fact is that you should think of it as a successful football team. The captain isn't telling all the people on the team exactly what to do all the time. They agree what they're doing, they agree the approach, and they go ahead as a team working together. Now, within whether it's a government department or a corporation, if they start with the right plan, the right incentives and goals, and the right plan, and it's coordinated with the local elements, or say local government here, and the leaders and the managers there are part of developing the plan. They know their role, they've got their objectives, they've got their goals to meet, and thereafter, all head office, whatever need to do is monitor that things are going on properly. And it needn't be heavy-handed or detailed monitoring. A plan will normally have a series of stages, and I know I'm teaching Granny to suck eggs. Series of stages, a series of sub-goals to be met, the financial, operational, or whatever, and it's easy enough to monitor that these goals are being met, and pick them up at an early stage. And if things are going wrong, discuss it, find some change to the plan. It's not difficult. It's management 101, but you're quite right, Bill. A lot of the existing managers, if they've been involved in government for very long, they're part of a culture which is to control the details, tell them what to do. The old command and control. I know when I took over as general manager of the newspaper in New Zealand, it had been very, very much a command and control approach. And the previous general manager, our best friend, who died of a stroke, terribly sad, he was the command and control guy, but he was really, really good, exceptionally good. I remember after we'd had one series of meetings with our key unions, and they were great people. The father of the chapel, they call newspaper unions, printing unions are called chapels. Anyway, the father of chapel wrote, and he said, as usual, Bill explained, not you, Bill explained what we're going to do, and Peter explained why we're going to do it. And then we worked with them.
Just to wrap it up, we're coming on an hour and that. Is there also a problem in regards to the bureaucracy? It's fairly constant in our system of government and bureaucracy. We don't necessarily change the people over in the bureaucracy just because we change governments, like you see in the United States. The whole set of positions can in one department, just like the EPA in the United States. I mean, depending on the incoming colour of the party that's won the presidency, the whole bureaucracy can be swept aside. That's not such a big thing in Australia. But do you still think bureaucracies in Australia maintain that sort of, we've got to be steadfast and we're the rock, because we have this changing ideology with the politicians that come and go sort of thing. So is that one of the reasons you think they might be a little bit intractable in regards to improvement, because they see themselves to be there as a constant, while Labor and Liberal parties come and go?
Yes, I think, as I said right at the beginning, when I wrote my book 10, 11 years ago, it's called KISS, Keep It Simple, Government for the Silent Majority. I did that because, struggle and try as I could not find any aspect of governance, of management, which was done optimally, or in fact, well at all. And I think, unfortunately, to answer your question, there's maybe a dozen critical things you've got to get right. Miss out on any one of them, and it ain't going to work properly or optimally. And the point you're making about a change in party, so to me, that's part of the overall thing of so much is just driven by politics. As long as it's driven by politics rather than the needs of the population, the needs of the state, the real proper needs of the state, if it's driven by politics, you're buggered before you start.
Well, on that note, we might wind it up, and we'll put decentralisation into a very hard basket and ponder on it for the future. I'd like to thank you tonight for coming along, Peter, and giving us your time. It's been informative and enjoyable. And if you just stay online, I'll just wind up the show now and speak to you after.
Okay, fine. It's a pleasure. I thought it was a privilege to be able to talk to you and your folk. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Next week, we'll be back at the same time, and my guest will be Professor David Flint, and we'll be speaking on the Constitution and the separation of powers between states and the Commonwealth, something that's very relevant over this COVID period with the argy-bargy between the blame game and also implementation of the National Cabinet, which was first for since wartime, I think. So until then, thanks very much, and join me again next week. If you like the show, please share, like, and follow. And if you're on YouTube, please subscribe. Good night.